Hello and welcome to one and all. So we'll move on to the next topic in the industrial sector, Unit 6. The reasons for introducing the economic reforms. Okay, actually the 1991 policy, IPR, I mentioned to you, that was the policy through which the government announced the LPG model of growth. So that LPG model of growth is the economic reforms announced by the country. Okay, so now announced by the Congress government party through IPR 1991. Now, what are the reasons for introducing the economic reforms in our country? Reasons for introducing economic reforms in India. So India was starting from 1980s. India was in severe economic crisis. So there were so many reasons for that. So mainly because of the public sector was incurring severe losses. So India was having a severe economic crisis. So some of the features of that necessitated the government to introduce the economic reforms. So these were all the crises. The first one, public sector, or in other words, the public revenue was lesser than the public expenditure. So that is what public here refers to government. So government revenue was much lesser than the government's expenditure. So in order to bridge the gap, the government was forced to borrow. So the government had to borrow heavily and was caught in something called as debt trap. So both the internal and external debt of the country increased enormously. Fiscal deficit of the public revenue was lesser than the public expenditure. So the government had to borrow. So the fiscal deficit of the country increased enormously, more than 6% or 7% of the GDP. Okay, and sometimes it reached even to the 2-digit level. And coupled with the fact that there was a rise in general price level. So the inflation, for the first time, it reached the two-digit mark. So inflation was around 12%. So first time in history, the inflationary trends in the country, the general price level reached the 2-digit mark. So if it is more than 10%, it comes under the category of hyperinflation. So that is a very, very heavy rise in the general price level. The general price level should not exceed more than 4% or 4 to 6%. That is the 6% is a warning. Okay, so because if it crosses beyond 6%, then it will be very difficult to control or arrest the rise in the general price level. So during this point of time, the general price level in the country reached almost to 12%. Okay, and apart from that, there was a severe balance of payments deficit. That is, our export earnings were much lesser than the whatever the payments we have to make through the imports. So it's a severe balance of payments deficit or crisis. And at one point of time, our foreign exchange reserves were sufficient for the import of next only for 2 weeks. Only that much amount of foreign exchange reserves were available with the country. So our foreign exchange reserves were sufficient only for next 2 weeks. So in order to increase the exports and decrease the imports, because India was facing a severe crisis in the balance of payments, severe crisis in the foreign exchange reserves. So the government had to devalue the Indian rupees, devalue the currency. So the government had to devalue the domestic currency against dollars, domestic currency, which further increased the general price level. So which further increased the general price level. So normally, no government will devalue the domestic currency. It is only as a last resort. If no other measure is possible, no other method is working on, only then normally the governments would devalue the domestic currency against the foreign currency. So at this point of time, India had no other option because of a severe foreign exchange crisis in the country. India had to do something to increase the exports and decrease the imports. So the government had to devalue the domestic currency, but the problem is it further accentuated the general price level in the country. So these were all the severe symptoms or the severe economic crisis that were faced by our country during the late 1980s. So what happened? So India approached International Monetary Fund for a loan of $7 million. So India approached the International Monetary Fund for a loan of $7 million. So which was paid sanction to India under certain conditions. So that condition is the government had to open up its doors for globalization as well as the public sector. All these were happening because of the inefficiency of the public sector. So the public sector had to be privatized. So that's what the condition on which the International Monetary Fund has sanctioned the loans to the government of India. So $7 million, which was sanctioned against two conditions. So the first one is India will remove the restrictions on private sector So that is what is privatization. That is the liberalization and privatization. And the second one also, India would remove the trade restrictions on foreign countries. So also India was having so much of restrictions in the form of import and export duties, in the form of restrictions on international trade. In spite of that, our foreign exchange reserves were very, very scarce. So also India would remove the trade restrictions between India and foreign countries. So many restrictions were there at that point of time. India was supposed to remove all those restrictions. So that is what is the globalization. So under these conditions, the International Monetary Fund has sanctioned the loan of $7 million. So because of this reason, India was forced to introduce the economic reforms in 1991. So all this because of the inefficient management of the economy, which was greatly attributed to the inefficient working of the public sector companies in the country. So the public sector had to be privatized. So this is the background of introducing the liberalization, privatization, and globalization in our country. Okay. Now moving on to the what is that liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So under that first one, liberalization. So what is the meaning of liberalization? It is removing all the restrictions which were imposed by the government on the private sector. So the meaning is, so liberalization, it refers to the removal of all unwanted restrictions. So there were too much of formalities. If the private sector has to open a project or the private sector has to start a business or start an industry, there was too much of restrictions in our country. So all those restrictions have to be removed. Restrictions on trade and industry, which were imposed on private sector. So relaxing the, or in other words, it is relaxing the rules and regulations on private sector. To put it very simply, relaxing the rules and regulations for the private sector. So this is the meaning of liberalization. So now all the features of liberalization is the same as what are all the features of 1991 industrial policy resolution. So the features of liberalization policy. So removal of, abolition of industrial licensing, relaxing the MRTP restrictions, all those we have seen, isn't it? All those are the liberalization measures. Okay, so that is abolition of industrial licensing. So removal of licensing, compulsory licensing for the private sector, that is one of the liberal method, relaxing the rules, isn't it? The private sector can easily start their ventures. So abolition of industrial licensing, removal of all those restrictions, relaxation of MRTP restrictions, that is the monopoly companies can, without any restriction, they can expand their business. I mentioned to you, it was replaced by more liberal competition act. And then the government also allowed the free entry of foreign investment and foreign technology. So all these are the liberal methods on the private sector, foreign investment as well as foreign technology. So these are all the same features, same as the features of IPR 1991. So all these are all the liberalization features. Okay. Then the next one is, so what is the purpose of liberalizing the rules and regulations on the private sector? Because the government wanted the private sector to participate in the growth of the country. So whatever the monopoly of the government, monopoly of the public sector, they have to be handed over to the private sector, so that the government can do only by relaxing all the rules and regulations on the private sector. So the first step is the liberalization. First, relax all the rules and regulation. Then allow the private sector to take over the companies which were exclusively reserved for the public sector. And that is what is known as privatization. Okay. So first liberalization. The second reform is the second step is the privatization. So the privatization means introducing the private sector in the publicly owned company. So privatization refers to the introduction of private ownership in public sector enterprises. So no longer it will be under the control of the government. It will be handed over to the private sector. So introduction of private ownership in the publicly owned public sector enterprises. Okay. So that is it is the transfer of ownership, property, or business from the government to the private sector. So whatever the business, whatever the ventures which are earlier exclusively owned by the public sector or partly owned by the public sector will be handed over to the private sector, either completely or again partly handed over to the private sector. So this is the meaning of privatization. Okay. Now, what are all the reasons or what are all the advantages of privatization? So we have both the advantages as well as disadvantages of introducing privatization in our country. First, let us check out what are all the advantages of privatization. So the first one is to reduce the burden of the government. So now what is happening? So many major projects have been taken over by the government, which is causing an enormous delay in the completion of the projects. So because of this enormous delay, the cost of production keeps on increasing. So if the project is completed within the stipulated time, then you will be completing the project at the estimated cost. But if the project is not completed at the stipulated time, the cost of production will keep on increasing. So most of the projects, especially all those multi-purpose projects and all heavy investment projects under the public sector, they couldn't be completed on the stipulated time. So because of that, there was a huge rise in the cost of production for the public sector enterprises, which is increasing the burden on the exchequer of the government. So in order to reduce the burden of the government, if the part of the public sector enterprises which are not non-strategic, we have seen, isn't it? If they are handed over to the private sector, then the burden of the government will reduce. So that is the first advantage. So as most of the public sector undertakings or incurring losses, incurring heavy losses. The reason is due to delays in completing several projects. Delays in completing several projects, which raises the cost of production. Privatization will reduce this burden. Privatization will reduce this burden on the public sector. So the main part here is PSUs are incurring losses. What is the reason? Because of the delays in completing the several projects. So that is resulting in higher cost of production. So if it is handed over to the private sector, if not maybe the same project, or if it is different projects, so many things are under the public sector, isn't it? So whatever the unnecessary things are handed over to the private sector, that will reduce the burden on the government. Okay, so that is the first advantage. Then the second reason is to promote efficiency. To promote efficiency of the public sector enterprises. So how the privatization is going to help in improving the efficiency of the public sector? See, public sector lack of efficiency in the public sector is mainly because of lack of competition. Because once upon a time, there was no competition for the public sector. They were having the monopoly thing, isn't it? So they were lethargic. That seriousness was not there. But now, if the private sector enters, automatically the competition will increase, isn't it? So due to lack of competition, the public sector was affected by inefficient management, because nobody to question them. They are the monopoly all in all. So nobody to question them why there is inefficient management and all. So they were indulging in all the corrupt practices. So nobody questions why your product is inefficient, why your service is inefficient, because they are the monopoly. So etc. So if the private sector enters, then automatically there will be competition. So they will be forced to improve their efficiency. So the privatization will induce them to increase their productivity and improve their efficiency due to competition. Due to competition. Okay. Then the next reason is to enhance investment opportunities. So because of the introduction of privatization and competition, if the performance of the public sector increases, so then the status of the public sector will increase. So if the status of the public sector increases, then that will attract more and more amount of investment in the public sector. So as privatization help to reduce the problems of the public sector, all this corruption, inefficient management, losses, most importantly, the losses of the public sector. So those were all the main problems of the public sector. So those problems were, mitigated because of the introduction of private sector. So the economic status of the public sector improved. Economic status in the sense that they started showing some kind of profit, they started showing some kind of performance, some kind of revenue. So that is the economic status. In that way, the economic status of the public sector improved. So if the economic status improve, automatically it will attract more and more amount of investments. So this brought good returns and attracted more investments. Okay, then the next one is to facilitate growth of infrastructure. So now because of the competition and the private sector, the entry of private sector, it necessitates the improvement in the infrastructural facilities in the country, because the production has to be done on modern lines with the up-to-date technology and all. So unless the infrastructural facilities are properly provided to the private sector, they will not be able to operate. So this forced the government to improve the infrastructural facilities in the country. Okay. So privatization forced the government to improve the infrastructural facilities in the country. What is the reason? As industries, they now have to be developed on modern lines. So unless the efficient infrastructural support is there, it is not possible. So this necessitated to improve the infrastructural facilities in the country. Okay. Then the next one is to reduce unnecessary bureaucratic interventions. So that will not, if the private sector will not allow the government to frequently interfere in their decisions, which was happening in the public sector, because it's a government owned. So the government will periodically intervene in all the affairs of the public sector undertakings. So which was very, very problematic, because the decisions could not be made very easily. But that's another reason for most of the public sector incurring losses. Okay, but the private sector will not allow this unnecessary interventions by the government. So they need more freedom. So the decision making will be quicker, and that will increase the productivity and the profitability of the private sector. So privatization prevented unnecessary government intervention. So they prevented the unnecessary government intervention. This gave them more freedom, and they can make their own decision. That is an autonomous decision and autonomy, which increased their productivity and also their profits. So these are some of the advantages of having the privatization in the country. Now moving on to what are all the disadvantages or the drawbacks of privatization. So the first drawback of privatization is private sector will not work for the welfare motive, isn't it? They will work for only increase their own profits. So the first disadvantage of privatization is loss of social welfare. So loss of social welfare because they are mostly profit motivated. So they will not give any importance to the welfare motive of the general public. Okay. So that means what? They will produce only those kind of commodities. They will produce only those kind, involve themselves in only those kind of services which are increasing their own profit. So the welfare of the general public is neglected. Then the second one is corruption. So it is not that private sector is corruption free. So they will also, if the I mean, even though the private sector is invited by the government to supplement the efforts of the government, the private sector was always regulated by the government. So there was also too much of conditions imposed, restrictions imposed on the private sector. They have to follow the rules and regulations of the government. So then most of the private sector, they will indulge in, if there are too many rules and regulations, they will all automatically try to indulge and bypass the rules and regulations of the government. So that amounting to corruption of the government. So because the first point itself, the government cannot say that you should not produce this commodity usually because that is you are neglecting the welfare motive. You should not involve yourself in providing this kind of service. So no private sector will come forward to produce only those commodities and only those services which is going to promote the welfare of the general public. That itself is a bypassing the rules and regulation of the government. So they will find a way, they'll find the loopholes to bypass all the rules and regulations of the government, and that leads to corruption. And then the third one is something called as lobbying. Lobbying here means the private sector will see to it that in out of the total revenue, they see to it that the share of profits are always more than the share of wages. That is lobbying. So they are not bothered about paying the equal return or proper return to the staff members working in their organization. So they are more bothered about their profit. So they will see to it that they lobby, they market, they advertise in such a way that they indulge in all those activities in such a way that out of the total revenue, the share of profits are always higher than the share of wages. So that is lobbying. And of course, the welfare of the laborers are affected, isn't it? And then malpractices. So equal to corruption. So malpractices here also because of they are trying to evade the taxes and they indulge in malpractice in production and then cheap quality goods. So all those are possible even in the private sector. Okay. And why they are indulging in all those things? Because all these things only will improve more and more of profits. So they are interested only in getting more amount of profits. So how will, in what way they will get more and more amount of profits? The revenue has to be higher than the cost of production. So if they, if they use the quality raw materials and all, automatically the cost of production will be high, isn't it? So if they use, one example, if they use some inferior quality raw material, the cost of production will be lesser and their revenue will be more, and that will increase their profit. So they will indulge in all those activities which will in such a way that increases their profits. And finally, high prices, because they, of course, they are interested in profits, and then they are not getting any concessions in the form of subsidies from the government. They are taxed also. So whatever the tax that is imposed by the government on the private sector, that they are compensating by charging high prices on their products. So which finally is going to affect only the consumers. So these are all the other side of the drawbacks of privatization. But in spite of that, the private sector especially after 1991 has played a greater role in the economic development of our country. Okay, so it is not that, for a long time, it is going to continue that we are having both the public and private sector operating side by side. But as of now, in most of the areas, the private sector is dominating. Okay, so these are all the merits and demerits, or the advantages and disadvantages of privatization. So you will get the liberalization, privatization, you will get the 2 marks also, and this privatization you might get even for 5 marks. Okay, and in the next topic we will see about the globalization, and also how, in what way the government, what is the method adopted by the government to have privatization in the country. That is something called as disinvestment, which I will explain to you in my next class. Okay, so if you find this video useful, please like, share and subscribe, and also don't fail to mention your suggestions or doubts in the comment box. Okay, so until next class, take care. Bye bye.